Hi, I'm Linda Molyneux,
And I'm Janet Heisey.
and we formed the Blocked Veins MS Research Group to help launch research into CCSVI and its importance to MS patients. The team at St. Joseph Healthcare, Hamilton, and McMaster University are ready to go. They have everything in place to start this important work except the funding. So we're going to ask you to please donate and help us launch this important work now. Our website is www.blockedveinsmsresearchgroup.com.
Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
So what I'm going to try to do this afternoon is give you kind of an overview and fill in a bit of background about MS and as a lead-in to current interest in venous problems in MS. I'm going to assume that a few of you are fairly knowledgeable about MS, but a lot of you won't be, so I'll give you some of that background. So what is our conventional thoughts on MS? It's a fairly common disease. It's the commonest progressive neurologic disease affecting young adults, except maybe for migraine. And in our population, we're considered a fairly high-risk area. There's about a 1 in 1,000 prevalence of this disease. A little more common in women than in men, and typically starts between the ages of 20 and 50. Those are the usual ages, but it can be anywhere from the age of 5 to 65. We've always thought, and there's a fair amount of evidence for this, that it's a disease where our immune system, which is normally fighting off things like bacteria and viruses, starts to attack us ourselves. So it is one of many diseases known as autoimmune diseases. We know that there are important environmental and genetic factors. Kind of takes both coming together to get the disease.
Can I just turn this up a bit?
Is that a little better? Okay. One portion that's been missing from the puzzle, though, is what triggers the immune system to go amok. And most theories have thought there was probably several viruses. We'll bring that back into our discussion when we get to the venous problem. As a result of the immune problem, T and B lymphocytes start to attack us, our myelin, which is like the insulation around the nerves. And this little cartoon kind of illustrates that. So you can see in the left upper hand corner a blood vessel. Inside that are these lymphocytes, white blood cells basically. Normally they shouldn't be getting out of the blood vessel into the brain, but in MS they do. Once they get there, they produce antibodies and a number of chemicals called cytokines that lead to inflammation and an attack on the myelin. So the myelin is illustrated sort of in the lower right-hand corner. That's a nerve fiber, also known as an axon. That's how nerve cells communicate one cell to the next. The electrical impulse passes along the axon, and its passage is speeded up by myelin, which is like the insulation around the nerve. So in our cartoon here, the sausage-like, from this angle it looks sort of yellowish, but if I got an arrow, I do. Right here, this is the myelin, and this is the bare axon. Here we can see the T cell attacking the myelin. As a result of that, you get areas that have myelin stripped off. The conduction can suddenly block or slow down or short circuit, and that leads to the symptoms that occur in MS. In the last decade, we've realized that it's not only myelin that is affected, though, and in later stages of the disease, the fiber or axon itself also degenerates. So we now think of MS as both a degenerative disorder as well as a demyelinating disorder. The clinical course varies quite a bit, and there are several subtypes that are possible. And I'm going to just show you a little cartoon of that as well, because it is relevant perhaps to how people respond to treatments. So you can see here the various subtypes. Again, if I can grab the arrow again. Most people with MS have relapsing remitting disease. What that refers to, a relapse is like an attack or flare-up where more myelin is being damaged. In many cases, after a while, it improves again, but not always back to normal. So that is shown here, cruising along over time. Here's an attack or relapse, and then this person recovers. Here's a second attack, but they don't recover fully, and now they have some disability that they live with, and so on. And over time, unfortunately, in many, but not all cases, it gets worse. A small percentage of patients have a fairly benign form of relapsing remitting called benign MS. 50% of MS patients, after they've had the disease for 10 years or more, and probably even higher percentages if you go beyond that, start to develop gradual progression as well. And that's what we call secondary progressive disease. So in this little illustration, after this attack, the person starts to change gradually without actually having attacks. Some of that pertains to the damage to the nerve fiber or axon. Occasionally at that stage, they no longer have attacks, as this person does, or some of them will have attacks superimposed. Let's not worry about minutiae. About 10% of MS patients will be progressive right from the get-go, and that's shown in the bottom. That's primary progressive disease. If they happen to have the odd little attack superimposed, it's called progressive relapsing. Again, most of us think those two bottom ones belong together. Are all these distinctions important? Well, they affect the prognosis in the disease. They also seem to affect what's going to happen with our current treatments. So people with progressive disease don't benefit as much from our current treatments. What sort of treatments do we have these days? Well, in the last 15 years, progress has been made. We have a number of treatments, but none of them are cures. And to put things in perspective, we can reduce the total number of relapses or attacks by about a third. We can limit the number of new areas of inflammation that show up in MRI scans and the amount of new damage that presents as disability partially, but we can't stop it in its tracks, and we can't undo damage that's already there. So although we're making some progress, I think we'd all agree I'm still here. I think we'd all agree that there's progress and improvement that can be made, and that's why we're all desperately looking for something. So with that background, in the last year or so, Dr. Zamboni in Italy, acting on previous observations of others in the past, and also some observations from Dr. Heike. He'll be speaking to you a little later, and he'll show you some of the actual very interesting and kind of exciting pictures of the problems that are seen in veins. He looked at the hypothesis that MS may be related more to the veins and not just an autoimmune disease, or maybe the problem in the veins triggers the autoimmune problem in the first place. Perhaps we can wed these two theories together eventually. And not to drown you in statistics, but these are his results in a nutshell. And he studied 65 MS patients as well as 65 normal controls and people with other neurologic diseases as well. And amongst those, he had 35 that were relapsing remitting, 20 that were secondary progressive, and 10 that were primary progressive. And these were fairly representative patients, although they were more in the mild to moderate range rather than the severe range. And this illustration shows his results for ultrasounds. He also looked at direct venograms, and he found really a striking incidence of problems with the veins. So you can see here in the various groups, so relapsing remitting, there were 5 different criteria shown there on the bottom of problems suggesting blockage or flow the wrong direction in veins. And you can see it varies anywhere from 51 to 77%. Pardon me, there's 126 in there as well, and so on across the board. 95% of the patients had 2 or more of these criteria that we think of as abnormal. The chances of having that compared to someone who was otherwise well was 43 to 1. So those are really striking figures. and certainly behoove further study. We'd like to know, is this as striking as his figures? Because it is so far only 65 people in this one study. At this point, you might say, well, why don't we just launch into treating everybody? Personally, I think at this stage we really need to corroborate these results for several reasons. First of all, this is a huge paradigm shift in how we think about MS. And if we're going to get the neurologic community sort of on board, we really need to have bigger numbers to convince people